What if the real power behind the rise of the dollar was never the government itself, but a small circle of families who learned to shape global markets long before the world even realized it was happening? This question often sounds uncomfortable, almost conspiratorial, yet history repeatedly shows that currencies do not become dominant by accident. They rise through strategy, influence, and the ability to direct economic destiny. When we revisit the origins of the dollar's supremacy, we find much more than political decisions. We uncover networks of financial dynasties who understood that controlling a currency meant controlling nations, resources, and the flow of global wealth. And the deeper we go, the more we see how patterns of manipulation, opportunity, and timing were woven into the foundations of American economic power. In the early stages, while the United States struggled to define its identity, these elite families were already positioning themselves inside the mechanisms that would later control monetary circulation, international lending, and industrial expansion. They saw crises not as threats, but as entry points. They shaped the narrative around stability, credit, and trust in the dollar, creating a perception of reliability that attracted foreign capital while concentrating profits in their own hands. It is fascinating how, throughout history, whenever a major financial shift occurred, the same surnames reappeared, aligned with institutions that silently guided economic transitions. This strategic vision allowed them not only to accumulate wealth, but to influence how the world evaluated currency strength, geopolitical risk, and the future of international markets. Understanding this dynamics forces us to reinterpret the dollar's rise not as a natural consequence of American success, but as a carefully constructed system designed to benefit those who knew how to steer its trajectory. And as you hear this, you might start to notice echoes of these patterns in modern economic events, raising the question, have we been observing a cycle repeating itself without recognizing who truly benefits from it? If this perspective intrigues you or challenges what you believed about global finance, share your thoughts in the comments, because your interpretation adds meaning to this discussion. And take a moment to like this video and check if you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss what comes next as we continue unfolding the E. Forces that shaped this financial empire, moving deeper into the hidden strategies that transformed the dollar into a symbol of unmatched global influence. As we move deeper into the historical timeline, a striking pattern emerges. Global crises that appeared spontaneous or unpredictable often coincided with moments when the dollar suddenly strengthened and key American elites expanded their influence. When we examined currency shocks, debt restructurings, and international market collapses from a broader perspective, the sequence begins to look less accidental and more like a cycle that certain groups were prepared to exploit. These families had access to information networks, banking alliances, and geopolitical forecasting tools that allowed them to anticipate international instability long before ordinary investors or even governments reacted. While the public saw chaos, they saw positioning. While nations struggled to stabilize their economies, they quietly increased their share of global assets. The most revealing aspect of this pattern is how crises were reframed as opportunities to reinforce the narrative of the dollar as a safe haven. Whenever a major economy faltered, capital fled toward American markets, not solely because the dollar was inherently superior, but because decades of influence had crafted a perception of unshakable security. This perception was actively maintained through institutions, media channels, and international agreements, shaped by the very individuals who gained the most from these movements. As a result, each crisis produced a powerful feedback loop. Global panic elevated the dollar. The dollar's rise enriched those positioned to benefit from it, and the newfound wealth expanded their ability to influence the next cycle. Another important element was the strategic timing of policy decisions. Interest rate shifts, credit expansions, and emergency lending programs appeared outwardly as reactions to global instability, yet they often aligned perfectly with moments when elite investors were entering or exiting specific markets. Their proximity to the decision-making mechanisms allowed them to act with a precision that amplified their gains while limiting their exposure to risk. Over time, this created an environment in which the dollar's dominance was not only protected, but systematically reinforced by the very disruptions that weakened other nations. This interplay between crisis and advantage is crucial to understanding how American elites extended their reach beyond domestic borders, preparing the ground for even more sophisticated methods of influence that would reshape global markets in the decades that followed, gradually revealing how deeply interconnected financial power and geopolitical events had become, leading us toward the next layer of this complex structure. To understand how America's elite families expanded their financial reach, we need to examine the subtle but powerful mechanisms they use to influence central banks, international lending institutions, and foreign monetary policies. This influence rarely appeared in public documents or official statements. Instead, it operated through advisory roles, private consultations, and the placement of key individuals inside organizations that shaped the global economic agenda. Throughout the 20th century, as nations rebuilt after wars or sought stability during periods of inflation, these families leveraged their banking empires to position themselves as indispensable partners. Their advice, loans, and currency strategies shaped the monetary frameworks of entire regions, often steering decisions that aligned with the long-term dominance of the dollar. This influence became especially evident when emerging economies attempted to challenge American financial supremacy. Whenever alternative currency blocks, regional alliances, or independent monetary plans began to gain traction, subtle forms of pressure emerged. Credit ratings shifted, investment flows were redirected, and warnings about instability were echoed across major financial publications. These signals, though framed as objective assessments, frequently mirrored the interests of the institutions connected to America's financial dynasties. By shaping global perception, they shaped global reality. Currencies weakened or strengthened according to narratives crafted by experts who were anything but neutral. And behind those, experts stood networks of families who understood that controlling information was nearly as important as controlling capital. Their reach extended into the architecture of international monetary policy. Through long-established ties with central bankers, political leaders, and global think tanks, they influenced standards for reserve currencies, debt restructuring programs, and international trade settlements. Every time a new financial guideline was implemented, the dollar seemed to emerge. Slightly stronger, more necessary, more central to global commerce. It was not coincidence, but a reflection of the careful alignment between private interests and public policy. The same families who benefited from dollar-denominated assets also shaped the environment that guaranteed the dollar's continued dominance. This synergy allowed them to maintain wealth across generations, adapt to new geopolitical contexts, and anticipate shifts that others could only react to. Yet this was only one layer of their strategic power because, as the world entered an era marked by conflict and reconstruction, their influence would intertwine even more deeply with global events, revealing the next phase of how monetary control became a tool for reshaping entire nations. As global conflicts reshaped borders and economies, another layer of strategic influence emerged, revealing how war and reconstruction became essential tools for expanding American financial power. Each major conflict of the 20th century generated massive demands for weapons, supplies, credit, and post-war rebuilding efforts. And behind these monumental shifts were the elite families who had already entrenched themselves in industries tied to steel, oil, shipping, and banking. They understood that war destabilized currencies and redirected global trade flows, and they also knew that the dollar, backed by their influence, could become the anchor around which the world reorganized itself. By financing governments, supplying industries, and underwriting reconstruction loans, they positioned themselves at the center of economic recovery, ensuring that every rebuilding effort strengthened the dollar's global role. When nations emerged from conflict, weakened, indebted, and desperate for stability, they often turned to American institutions for guidance. These institutions, shaped by the vision of the same powerful families, promoted policies that aligned local economies with the interests of the United States. Exchange rates were redefined, central banks were restructured, and new monetary systems were introduced, with the dollar serving as the backbone of international recovery. This was not merely financial assistance. It was a restructuring of global economic power disguised as support. Countries that accepted these terms found themselves tied to dollar-denominated debt, dependent on American markets, and vulnerable to decisions made in faraway boardrooms they had little influence over. What made this strategy especially effective was the timing. Every crisis created a vacuum, and every vacuum became an opportunity. As Europe, Asia, and the Middle East rebuilt after devastating conflicts, American elites expanded their reach into industries that had once been national monopolies. They acquired infrastructure, secured energy routes, and negotiated trade agreements that funneled wealth toward institutions they controlled. The narrative of partnership and progress masked the underlying reality. These families were writing the next chapter of global finance, while ensuring their dominance became increasingly difficult to challenge. And as their influence grew, they began to shift from reacting to world events to shaping them, using economic leverage to determine which markets would rise, which alliances would form, and which nations would struggle under the weight of their dependence. This subtle evolution from opportunists to architects marked a turning point in their strategy, setting the stage for even more sophisticated forms of market control that defined the next era of global power. If this perspective resonates with you or sparks a different interpretation, share your thoughts in the comments so we can expand this discussion together. As the reach of these powerful families expanded beyond the battlefield and the reconstruction zones, a quieter but equally decisive force began to shape the global economy. The alliances formed between industry, finance, and political leadership. These alliances were not temporary arrangements, but long-term ecosystems, where each sector fed into the other, reinforcing a cycle of influence that became nearly impossible to disrupt. Industrial magnates needed access to international credit and stable markets. Financiers needed regulatory support and geopolitical protection. Politicians needed funding, strategic counsel, and the appearance of economic progress. Together, they built a framework in which the interests of a select few aligned so closely with national strategy that distinguishing between public policy and private gain became increasingly difficult. Within this framework, entire markets were shaped long before they reached the public. Decisions regarding energy supply routes, manufacturing priorities, agricultural exports, and technological innovation were influenced by private discussions that set the direction of global trade. These families, with stakes in multiple industries, understood how to coordinate economic movements across sectors. When steel production surged, shipping networks expanded. When oil markets shifted, financial instruments tied to energy markets followed. When geopolitical tension rose, defense industries grew in value. Each of these movements reinforced the dollar's centrality as the currency became the standard reference point for contracts, pricing, and long-term investment. The more interconnected the system became, the more the dollar evolved from a national currency into the backbone of global commerce. This web of alliances also meant that these families could anticipate shifts that others would only recognize in hindsight. They knew when regulations would tighten, when trade agreements would be renegotiated, and when technological breakthroughs would disrupt supply chains. Information flowed seamlessly among them, allowing coordinated action that magnified their influence. Markets that seemed volatile to ordinary. Investors appeared predictable to those who shaped the conditions behind the scenes. And every time the dollar strengthened, every time a new global standard was introduced, every time a political event redirected international capital, these alliances consolidated their role as the informal architects of the modern economic landscape. Over time, this interconnected power structure created a new reality. The fortunes of the dollar were no longer tied solely to the economic performance of the United States, but to the strategic decisions of those who controlled these transnational alliances. Their reach extended beyond borders, beyond industries, and beyond the expectations of governments attempting to regulate them. And as the world entered a period of rapid technological advancement and shifting geopolitical rivalry, their ability to anticipate and shape the next financial era became even more pronounced, revealing deeper layers of strategy that would define the evolution of global markets in the decades ahead. As global markets matured and financial systems became more complex, the most influential American families refined their strategies to operate on a level far beyond traditional investment. Instead of simply reacting to fluctuations, they studied the underlying cycles that shaped those fluctuations. Economic collapses, currency devaluations, sovereign debt crises, commodity shortages, and periods of rapid inflation were not viewed as isolated disruptions, but as predictable phases of a repeating historical pattern. By analyzing long-term trends, political instability, demographic shifts, and institutional behavior, they built models that allowed them to anticipate moments of rupture long before they reached the surface. What the world interpreted as sudden shocks often appeared to these families as scheduled events within a broader rhythm of global finance. Their ability to foresee these turning points granted them a tremendous advantage. When crises began to form, they were already repositioning their assets. When markets collapsed, they acquired undervalued resources with precision. When currencies weakened, they fortified their holdings in more stable instruments. And as nations scrambled to contain the damage, these families entered as strategic partners offering credit, liquidity, or investment exactly when governments were most vulnerable. This allowed them to influence policy from within, shaping recovery programs in ways that aligned with their long-term interests. Every downturn became a mechanism not merely to preserve wealth, but to multiply it, reinforcing the dollar's dominance as capital flowed toward the stability they projected. What made this approach especially effective was their mastery of timing. Acting too early risked exposure, acting too late diminished opportunity. But by accessing networks of intelligence that spanned diplomatic circles, international banks, and multinational corporations, they recognized subtle indicators that went unnoticed by the broader market. A shift in commodity reserves, a quiet change in trade policy, an adjustment in central bank language, or the early signs of political fragmentation. Each signal contributed to their understanding of when a cycle was nearing its pivot. Their strategies became a blend of economic foresight and geopolitical analysis, allowing them to move with a confidence that appeared uncanny to outside observers. Over generations, this predictive power created a kind of invisible steering mechanism within global finance. The public believed markets were driven by supply and demand, fear and optimism, news and speculation. But behind these forces were individuals who not only anticipated the direction of history, but positioned themselves at the helm of its most profitable moments. Their understanding of cycles became a tool for shaping the economic narrative itself, guiding expectations, influencing investment flows, and preparing the stage for even more sophisticated manipulation of global perception, which would become increasingly important as economic narratives began to rival economic realities in shaping the world's financial landscape. As global finance evolved beyond numbers and institutions, another dimension of influence emerged, one far less visible but equally powerful: the construction of economic narratives. These narratives did not merely describe market conditions, they shaped how societies interpreted risk, opportunity, and the very nature of economic stability. America's most influential families understood early on that perception often moves markets faster than reality. By guiding public expectations, framing economic events, and controlling the flow of information, they could tilt global reactions in ways that aligned with their strategic objectives. Reports, expert analyses, think tank white papers, and media commentary became instruments through which they directed the emotional pulse of the financial world. What made these narratives so effective was their subtlety. They rarely appeared as overt manipulation. Instead, they blended seamlessly with the language of economic logic and institutional authority. When warnings about inflation emerged, they influenced how investors responded. When optimism about growth was broadcast, it encouraged capital flows exactly where they stood to benefit. Even geopolitical tensions were framed in ways that justified shifts in currency reserves or trade routes, reinforcing the dollar's status as a safe haven. Over time, these narratives became self-fulfilling. The more people believed in the dollar's stability, the more they relied on it, and the more powerful it became compared to competing currencies. Behind this storytelling machinery were networks of advisors, economists, and analysts whose careers often depended on maintaining alignment with these powerful interests. Their research shaped policy debates. Their commentary moved markets, and their predictions influenced international negotiations. By controlling the intellectual environment in which decisions were made, these families ensured that alternatives to the dollar were consistently viewed with skepticism. Economies that attempted to break free from this influence faced pressure not only from financial markets, but from the narrative ecosystem itself, which cast doubt on the legitimacy of their reforms. As the world became increasingly interconnected, the ability to shape narratives grew even more valuable. Global audiences reacted instantly to news, forecasts, and rumors. A sentence in a financial report could trigger massive shifts in investment flows. A strategically placed interview could redefine an entire region's reputation. By mastering this power, these families moved beyond influencing events. They influenced how events were understood. And in a world where perception often dictates reality, this was one of their most potent tools for preserving control over markets and ensuring the dollar remained the central pillar of global finance. If this perspective opened new insights or challenged what you believed about economic storytelling, share your thoughts in the comments so we can deepen this discussion together. As the foundations of global markets shifted toward a more integrated and resource-dependent world, another strategic layer of influence emerged: the control of commodities essential to economic stability. While currencies and financial systems could be shaped through policy and perception, commodities offered something even more powerful: leverage rooted in physical necessity. Oil, steel, rare minerals, agricultural staples, and later technological components like silicon and lithium became instruments through which elite American families extended their reach far beyond traditional banking. By securing ownership, transportation routes, processing facilities, and global distribution chains, they positioned themselves at the center of industries that determined the rhythm of modern life. The brilliance of this strategy lay not only in acquiring resources, but in understanding how commodity markets reacted to geopolitical tension. A conflict in one region could raise oil prices worldwide. A drought could shift grain futures. A trade dispute could transform the value of metals or energy reserves. These families learned to anticipate these fluctuations, using their influence to advance policies that indirectly strengthened their positions. They backed multinational corporations whose operations spanned continents, giving them insight into supply disruptions long before they became public knowledge. When crises unfolded, they were already moving capital, redirecting shipments and adjusting portfolios to capture gains while others struggled to respond. These dynamics also reinforced the centrality of the dollar. Because most global commodities were priced in dollars, any instability that pushed nations to increase their reserves or secure long-term contracts strengthened American financial dominance. As demand for commodities grew, demand for the dollar grew with it. This cycle ensured that even countries skeptical of American political influence remained dependent on its currency for survival. And behind this dependency were families who had mastered the art of connecting physical resources with financial power, shaping markets from the ground up while presenting themselves as guardians of global stability. Over time, this commodity-based influence became intertwined with technological advancement. New industries required new materials, and controlling the extraction, refinement, and distribution of these materials provided even deeper strategic leverage. Nations attempting to develop independent technologies found themselves reliant on supply chains quietly controlled by American interests. Even when rival economies rose, their industrial progress often depended on resources priced in dollars or transported through systems influenced by the same elite networks. This subtle but pervasive control created a world where markets, governments, and emerging powers all operated within a structure designed decades earlier, setting the stage for an even more complex future in which digital assets, energy transitions, and new geopolitical alliances would challenge the old order while still reflecting the influence of those who crafted the AIM foundation. As global finance entered the digital age, new forces began to challenge the long-standing structure built around the dollar, revealing vulnerabilities that had been invisible for decades. The rise of cryptocurrencies, central bank digital currencies, and regional monetary coalitions signaled a shift away from the traditional systems that had long favored American dominance. Emerging economies, particularly those seeking independence from dollar-based debt or geopolitical influence, began exploring alternatives that could weaken the foundations upon which elite American families had constructed their financial power. Yet, even within these disruptive trends, the patterns of influence established over the past century were still visible, shaping how transitions unfolded and how resistance to the old order was contained. Digital currencies introduced a new battlefield, one defined not by physical commodities or international trade routes, but by control over technological, infrastructure, and regulatory frameworks. While decentralized systems promised freedom from traditional financial elites, the reality proved more complicated. Large institutional investors, many connected to the same networks that shaped the dollar's rise, quickly entered the crypto space, absorbing disruptive potential and integrating it into their broader strategies. They backed platforms, influenced regulations, and steered market volatility in ways that mirrored familiar patterns from traditional finance. Even attempts by foreign governments to create independent digital currencies often depended on technologies, patents, or infrastructure tied to American corporations aligned with these elite interests. At the same time, geopolitical alliances shifted. Nations seeking alternatives to dollar dependence formed new trade agreements and reserve strategies, hoping to build financial ecosystems that could withstand American pressure. But these efforts revealed how deeply the dollar had been woven into the global fabric. Supply chains, energy markets, international lending standards, and institutional frameworks all relied on mechanisms shaped decades earlier. Breaking free required more than a new currency. It required re-engineering systems that had quietly centralized power in American hands. And while these movements presented real threats to the dollar's dominance, they also highlighted the strategic foresight of those who had built the original structure, demonstrating how resilient their design remained even in an era of rapid innovation. Yet, despite this resilience, the global rise of digital finance created momentum that could not be ignored. Shifts in public trust, generational attitudes toward money, and the increasing importance of data-driven economies began to tilt the balance toward new possibilities. For the first time, the dollar's supremacy faced a technological challenge rather than a geopolitical one. And as these forces converged, the question emerged whether the old architecture could adapt to a world where currency itself was becoming abstract, programmable, and detached from the physical systems that once guaranteed its strength, pushing the narrative toward a moment where the long arc of financial history meets an unprecedented turning point. As we reach the present moment, the long arc of the dollar's dominance reveals a tension that has been building quietly for decades. Every financial empire in history has risen through a combination of strategy, influence, and opportunity, but each has also reached a structural limit where the very mechanisms that once sustained its power begin to strain. For the dollar, this pressure emerges from multiple fronts at once. Global debt levels tied to American monetary policy have grown far beyond what earlier generations of strategists could have anticipated. Geopolitical rivals are forming coalitions designed to reduce dependence on U.S. financial systems. Technological innovation is reshaping the architecture of money itself, creating channels of exchange that function outside the traditional frameworks carefully designed by elite families over the last century. Yet even as these shifts accelerate, the core patterns that shape the dollar's ascent remain visible. Influence networks continue to guide policy. Markets still react to narratives crafted by institutions connected to deep financial power, and the global appetite for stability keeps pulling capital toward American assets whenever uncertainty rises. This paradox creates a moment of extraordinary tension, a currency that appears both indispensable and increasingly challenged. The question is not whether the dollar will disappear, but how it will evolve as emerging systems rewrite the rules of global finance. And in that evolution lies the possibility of a profound turning point, one where the world must confront whether a new financial order will merely replace the old. structures with different actors, or fundamentally transform how economic power is distributed. This unresolved transition defines the era we live in. Nations are experimenting with digital reserves. Private corporations are shaping payment infrastructures. Once controlled exclusively by governments and investors, are questioning long-standing assumptions about safety and stability. The families who once guided global markets from behind the curtain now face a landscape they cannot fully control, yet one still shaped by the institutions they built. As the world navigates this uncertain path, the future of the dollar becomes less a question of authority and more a question of adaptability. Its survival depends on how well it can align with a global system that is shifting toward decentralization, automation, and new forms of value that challenge the very meaning of money. If you stayed with me until this point, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me, so I know you reached the end," and connected with this idea. And if this exploration added value to your understanding of global markets, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. There is another video here that expands this discussion from a different angle. Click and continue with me as we move deeper into how power structures shape the world around us.